The wind came screaming down from the Rockies like the devil's own breath, carrying snow so thick a man couldn't see his hand in front of his face. Montana Territory in January of 1885 was no place for the weak, no place for the foolish, and certainly no place for second chances. But Jack Brennan had learned long ago that a man doesn't always get to choose his battles. Sometimes they choose him. He stood at the edge of the small cemetery plot behind his ranch house, hat in his weathered hands, staring down at two graves that had marked the border between his past and his present for 5 long years. The wooden crosses were simple, carved by his own hands from Montana pine. Ruth Brennan, 1855 to 1880. Baby Brennan, beloved daughter. The dates told the story in their brutal simplicity. His wife had died bringing their child into the world, and the child had followed her mother into darkness less than an hour later. 5 years, 60 months. 1,825 days of waking up alone, eating alone, working alone, and going to bed with nothing but the ghosts of what might have been for company. Jack had turned 33 last October, though he felt considerably older. The war had aged him as it had aged every man who'd worn the uniform and seen what men could do to each other when the music of battle played. The scar that ran from his left temple down to his jawline was a souvenir from Shiloh back in '62 when he'd been young enough to think he was immortal. He knew better now. The letter crinkled in his coat pocket as he shifted his weight. He'd read it so many times the creases were wearing thin, threatening to tear the paper into disconnected fragments. Just like his life, he supposed. Disconnected fragments of what used to be whole. Ruth, I kept my promise. The words formed in his mind, though he didn't speak them aloud. The wind was too loud for that, and besides, he'd learned that the dead didn't need spoken words. They heard the thoughts of the living. It's just fine or so, the pastor said. I didn't let anyone else in. I kept this place running, kept the cattle fed, kept the fences mended. I did everything a man's supposed to do, but this loneliness, Ruth, it's killing me slower than any bullet ever could. The wind shifted, and for just a moment, Jack could have sworn he heard Ruth's voice in it. Gentle like it had always been. Practical. She'd been a Missouri farm girl who'd married a soldier returning from the war, followed him west to carve out a new life in untamed country, and never once complained about the hardships. She'd made the cabin a home with her quilts and her cooking and her quiet strength. And when she'd gotten pregnant, Jack had dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, all the terrible things he'd done and seen could be balanced out by the simple act of bringing new life into the world. He'd been wrong. Jack turned away from the graves, pulling his coat tighter against the cold. The storm was getting worse, which meant he needed to get back to the cabin and make sure everything was battened down for the night. The cattle were in the lower pasture sheltered by the ridge and the pine grove. The horses were in the barn with enough hay to last them through whatever the sky decided to throw down. And he had enough venison stew simmering on the stove to feed himself for the next 3 days if this storm decided to dig in and stay a while. He'd made the stew 2 days ago the way Ruth had taught him, low and slow, letting the meat fall apart into tenderness, adding the root vegetables at just the right time so they didn't turn to mush. Cooking was one of the few pleasures he had left, though he wasn't particularly good at it. Ruth had always said he could burn water if left unsupervised. But he'd learned in the years since her death because a man had to eat and pride wouldn't let him live on hardtack and jerky alone. The cabin came into view through the swirling white, a dark shape against the storm with a single window glowing warm with lamplight. Home, such as it was. Jack had built it himself with help from Henry Walsh, the blacksmith from Sweetwater, who was the closest thing to a friend Jack had in this territory. Most folks in town gave Jack a wide berth. Part of it was his size. At 6'4" and built like a bull, he made most men uncomfortable just by existing in the same space. Part of it was the scar. And part of it was the stories that had followed him west from Missouri, whispers about a young man who'd killed another in a bar fight and disappeared into the war before the law could catch up with him. The whispers were true, every word, but Jack had learned that truth and justice weren't always the same thing. He stomped the snow off his boots on the porch and pushed open the door. Heat and the smell of cooking meat enveloped him, a welcome contrast to the bitter cold outside. He hung his hat on the peg by the door, shrugged out of his heavy coat, and moved to the stove to check the stew. Still simmering nicely, he gave it a stir with the wooden spoon, then ladled himself a small taste. Good. Ruth would have approved. The thought brought the familiar ache, but it was duller now than it had been even a year ago. Time didn't heal all wounds, but it did make them easier to live with. Or maybe he was just getting better at ignoring the pain. Jack settled into his chair by the fire, the one that faced the window, and pulled the letter from his pocket. He unfolded it carefully, smoothing out the creases, and read it again by the firelight, even though he knew every word by heart. Dear Mr. Brennan, the neat handwriting began. We are pleased to inform you that we have found a suitable match for your requirements. Mrs. Emma Hartwell is a 26-year-old widow from Boston, Massachusetts. She was previously employed as a teacher and comes highly recommended by her references. Mrs. Hartwell has expressed interest in relocating west for a new start and believes she would be well suited to life on a working ranch. She is educated, accomplished in domestic arts, and of good moral character. If you wish to proceed with this arrangement, please respond at your earliest convenience. Mrs. Hartwell is prepared to travel to Montana Territory and arrive by the 1st of February. 3 months ago, Jack had been drunk. Not falling down drunk, but drunk enough that the loneliness had overwhelmed his better judgment. Henry had found him at the saloon in Sweetwater, staring into his whiskey like it held the answers to questions he hadn't even figured out how to ask yet. Jack, you can't live with ghosts forever. Henry had said it quietly so the other patrons wouldn't hear. Ruth wouldn't want this. I don't know what Ruth would want. Jack had responded, the words coming out harsher than he'd intended. She's dead, Henry. Dead 5 years and not coming back. Henry had signaled the bartender for coffee, strong and black. Then she'd want you to live, not just survive. There's a difference, is there? Because from where I'm sitting, they look pretty much the same. Henry had pulled a newspaper from his coat pocket and spread it on the bar. It was from Cheyenne, a week old, and he'd already folded it to show a specific page, the classified advertisement section. And there, among the listings for land sales and livestock auctions, were the notices from the matrimonial agencies. Men seeking wives, women seeking husbands. A transaction as old as civilization itself, dressed up in polite language about companionship and mutual respect. Think about it, Henry had said. That's all I'm asking. Just think about it. Jack had thought about it. For approximately 12 more whiskeys. And then he'd done something monumentally stupid. He'd written a letter to the Cheyenne Matrimonial Agency describing himself in the most general terms possible. Rancher, 33 years old, widower, seeking a practical woman who understood the realities of frontier life. Someone who wouldn't expect romance or poetry or any of the things that had died with Ruth. The agency had written back within 2 weeks. They had several potential matches. Would he like to correspond with any of them? And so began the strangest 3 months of Jack Brennan's life. He'd exchanged letters with 3 different women, feeling increasingly ridiculous with each one he wrote. The first woman had seemed nice enough, but she'd asked too many questions about his financial situation and made it clear she expected to live in town, not on a ranch. The second had been pleasant, but clearly expected a level of refinement that Jack couldn't provide. She'd mentioned opera and theater in her letters' cultural pursuits that might as well have been on the moon for all the relevance they had to life in Montana Territory. But Emma Hartwell had been different. Her letters were direct, almost businesslike. She didn't romanticize the West or make grand declarations about adventure and new beginnings. She simply stated her situation. She was a widow. She had no family to speak of. She had skills that would be useful on a ranch. She was looking for security and a place to call home. In return, she could offer domestic labor, basic medical knowledge, and literacy skills that might prove useful. It had all been very transactional, very practical, exactly what Jack thought he wanted. They'd exchanged 6 letters over the course of 2 months. Emma had asked about the climate, the nearest town, the nature of the ranch work. Jack had answered honestly, perhaps more honestly than he should have. He'd told her about the harsh winters and the isolation. He'd mentioned that he was a man of few words who preferred silence to idle chatter. He'd explained that he was a widower who still grieved his lost family and probably always would. She'd written back saying she understood grief intimately and had no expectations of replacing what he'd lost. She simply wanted a chance at a different life than the one she'd been living. It should have worked. On paper, it made perfect sense. But then 3 weeks ago, Jack had woken up from a nightmare about Ruth's death. He'd relived it in vivid detail, the screaming that went on for hours, the midwife's increasingly worried face, the moment when the screaming stopped, and a terrible silence filled the cabin. He'd woken up drenched in sweat, gasping for air, and he'd realized something fundamental. He couldn't do it. He couldn't bring another woman into this house, into Ruth's house, and pretend it was anything other than a betrayal of everything they'd had together. He couldn't look at another woman sleeping in Ruth's bed, cooking at Ruth's stove, living the life that should have been Ruth's. So he'd written one final letter to the agency: cancel the arrangement. He'd changed his mind. He would send money to cover Emma Hartwell's inconvenience and any expenses she'd incurred preparing for the journey. He was sorry, but he simply couldn't go through with it. He'd sent the letter by post 3 weeks ago. Plenty of time for it to reach Cheyenne and for the agency to contact Emma before she made the journey. She wouldn't have left Boston yet. The travel arrangements would have taken time to organize. She would receive the message and probably be relieved. What kind of woman really wanted to marry a scarred stranger and move to the edge of nowhere anyway? Jack refolded the letter and slipped it back into his pocket. The fire crackled, sending up a shower of sparks. Outside, the wind continued its relentless howl. This storm was shaping up to be one of the worst of the winter, which was saying something. He'd need to check on the livestock again before full dark, make sure none of the fences had blown down and trapped any of the cattle. He stood stretching out the stiffness in his back. 33 wasn't old, but years of hard labor and old war wounds had a way of making a man feel older than his years. He moved to the window and looked out at the white chaos. Visibility was down to maybe 20 feet. The barn was barely visible as a dark shape against the snow. A man doesn't quit while he's breathing. His father had told him that back before the war, back when Jack had still been James McCarty and the world had made sense. His father had been a hard man, stern and unyielding, but he'd lived by a code: honor, duty, responsibility. A man's word was his bond. A man protected what was his. A man stood his ground when trouble came calling. Jack had tried to live by that code. He'd failed more times than he cared to count, but he kept trying. He was just turning away from the window when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. Faint, almost lost in the wind, but distinct. A knocking. Weak, irregular, but definitely someone knocking on his door. Jack froze. Nobody traveled in weather like this. Nobody with any sense anyway. For a moment, he wondered if he'd imagined it, if the isolation was finally getting to him, and his mind was starting to play tricks. Then it came again. Knock, pause, knock, knock, pause, tune, the rhythm of someone who was using the last of their strength. Jack crossed to the door in 3 long strides and yanked it open. A woman collapsed across his threshold. She was covered in snow, her clothing so caked with ice that it crackled when she moved. What little of her face Jack could see was deathly pale, her lips blue with cold. She was small, barely reaching his chest, and thin, in a way that suggested she'd been missing meals long before she'd started freezing to death on his doorstep. Mr. Brennan, the words came out in a whisper, her voice shaking so badly Jack could barely understand her. I'm Emma, your bride. I didn't receive your last letter. For a single frozen moment, Jack's mind went completely blank. Then training took over. Soldiers training, the kind drilled into you during the war when you had to make life or death decisions in the span of a heartbeat. He scooped her up in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a collection of bones and frozen cloth that should have been a living woman. Her head lolled against his chest as he kicked the door shut behind them and carried her to the chair by the fire. Damn it! The curse came out involuntarily as he set her down and started working at the buttons of her coat. The fabric was so frozen that his fingers struggled with the simple task. She's half dead, and it's my fault. If I'd sent that telegram instead of just a letter, she would have gotten the message in time. He got the coat off and tossed it aside. Her dress underneath was soaked through. Her hands were white, the fingers rigid with cold. Frostbite. Definitely frostbite. He'd seen it during the war, men who'd marched too long in the snow and lost toes, fingers, sometimes whole limbs, to the cold's merciless grip. Can you hear me, ma'am? He kept his voice steady, calm, the way he'd learned to do when everything was going to hell, and panic would only make things worse. She managed a tiny nod. Her teeth were chattering so violently that he could hear them clicking together. This is going to hurt. I need you to understand that. This is going to hurt like hell, but you have to let me do it. You hear me? Another nod, smaller this time. Jack moved to the stove where he kept a basin and a large pot of water. He'd learned during his years alone to keep water warming on the stove at all times. Hot water was useful for 100 different tasks, and besides, it kept the cabin air from getting too dry. Now that habit was probably going to save this woman's life. He tested the water temperature with his hand. Warm, not hot. Too hot, and it would damage the tissue. He'd seen that too during the war. Well-meaning soldiers plunging frostbitten hands into boiling water and making the damage 10 times worse. He carried the basin back to the chair and knelt in front of Emma. Her eyes were closed now, her breathing shallow. Not a good sign. Ma'am, I need you to stay awake. You understand? You go to sleep right now, you might not wake up. Her eyes fluttered open. They were brown, he noticed. A deep brown like rich earth. I'm going to take off your boots. Then I'm going to put your feet in this water. Like I said, it's going to hurt, but you have to endure it. He unlaced her boots, working quickly. They were good boots, well-made, the kind that cost real money back east. But they hadn't been designed for a Montana blizzard. He pulled them off, and her stockings followed. Her feet were gray, the toes white at the tips. Bad, but not the worst he'd seen. Jack lowered her feet into the water. Emma screamed. The sound cut through the cabin like a knife raw, an animal and full of agony. She tried to jerk her feet out of the basin, but Jack's hands clamped down on her ankles, holding her in place. I know. His voice was rough with sympathy, but his grip didn't loosen. I know it hurts, but you have to endure it. You hear me? You have to let the blood come back. She was crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks, her whole body shaking with more than just cold. Jack had held dying men in his arms during the war, had seen every kind of pain the human body could endure. This was up there with the worst of it. The agony of frozen tissue coming back to life, nerve endings screaming as circulation returned. He counted in his head. 60 seconds. 120. The medical corps had taught him to count during the war when there was nothing to do but wait and hope. 300 seconds. 5 minutes. Emma's screaming had faded to harsh, ragged sobbing. Her feet were changing colors, going from gray to an angry mottled red. Good, Jack said quietly. That's good. You're going to keep your toes. He stayed kneeling there, his hands still on her ankles until her breathing started to even out, and the violent shaking subsided to intermittent tremors. Then he carefully lifted her feet from the water and wrapped them in a clean towel from the shelf by the stove. Now your hands. He moved to work on her fingers, which were in similar condition. More warm water, more pain, but Emma seemed to have exhausted her capacity for screaming. She just sat there, tears running silently down her face as Jack massaged feeling back into her hands. You'll keep your fingers too. He told her once he was satisfied with their color. Could have been a lot worse. Thank you. The words came out hoarse, barely audible. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You're not out of the woods. He stood up, his knees protesting the movement. When was the last time you ate? She had to think about it, which told him everything he needed to know. Days. Maybe 3 days. I had some bread, on the train, and water. Some. Not much. Jack moved to the stove and ladled a generous portion of stew into a bowl. He added a thick slice of bread on the side. His practical side told him he should give her something lighter broth, maybe to ease her stomach back into the idea of food. But his eyes told him she needed substance, needed it desperately. He set the bowl on the small table beside the chair and handed her the spoon. Her hands were still shaking, but she managed to grip it. Eat. And while you're eating, you can tell me how the hell you ended up dying on my doorstep. Emma took a spoonful of stew, and Jack watched her face change as the warmth and flavor hit her tongue. She took another spoonful faster this time, and another. He let her eat in silence for a few minutes, giving her time to get some food into her system before he pressed for answers. Finally, when she'd made it through half the bowl, she set the spoon down and looked at him directly for the first time. I left Boston 4 days ago. Took the train to Cheyenne, then the stage to Sweetwater. But the stage broke down 20 miles out. The driver said he could fix it, but it would take until morning. I was the only passenger. He told me I could wait at a farmhouse we'd passed a mile back. She paused, taking a shaky breath. I waited 3 hours. He never came back. I found out later the farm family had told him to leave me there, that they'd get me to Sweetwater in their own wagon the next day. But during the night, the storm hit. They wouldn't let me stay. The woman said they didn't have room for charity cases. She gave me a horse and told me to follow the road. Jack felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather outside. They gave you a horse and sent you into a blizzard. Emma nodded. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't stay there, so I tried to make it to town. But the storm got worse and I couldn't see the road anymore. The horse collapsed about 2 hours ago. I left her there. I just started walking toward any light I could see. Your cabin was the only light. She looked down at her hands, which were slowly regaining their normal color. I'm sorry, I know you canceled the arrangement. I didn't receive your letter. The agency must have sent it to my old address, but I'd already left by then. I understand if you want me to leave as soon as the storm passes. Jack stared at her. This woman had traveled 2,000 miles based on letters from a stranger. She'd been abandoned by people who should have helped her. She'd nearly frozen to death, getting to a place where she wasn't even wanted anymore. And now she was apologizing to him. A man protects what's his. His father's voice clear, as if the old man was standing right there in the cabin. And a man doesn't turn away someone in need regardless of his own convenience. You're not going anywhere. Jack's voice came out rougher than he intended. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not until this storm passes and you've recovered your strength. Emma looked up at him, surprise clear on her face. But you said you changed your mind. You don't want a wife. Jack turned away, moving to stir the stew that didn't need stirring, giving himself a moment to figure out what the hell he was trying to say. What I want and what's right aren't always the same thing, ma'am. You came here in good faith based on an agreement I made. The fact that I got cold feet doesn't change that. You nearly died trying to honor your part of the bargain. The least I can do is honor mine by giving you shelter until you're well enough to make your own decisions about what comes next. He turned back to face her. But I need you to understand something. I'm not the man you corresponded with in those letters. I'm not looking for a fresh start or a new beginning. I'm a man who's buried his past and doesn't have much of a future to speak of. This ranch, this cabin, it's all I've got. And most days it's more than I deserve. Emma met his gaze steadily. Mr. Brennan, I didn't come here expecting romance or redemption. I came here because I needed to escape a situation that was becoming dangerous. I needed a place where I could work and be useful and not be afraid. If you're offering that even temporarily, then I'm grateful. And I don't need you to be anything other than what you are. There was something in her voice, something that suggested she understood danger and fear in a way that went beyond getting lost in a blizzard. Jack filed that information away for later examination. Fair enough. He gestured to the hallway that led to the cabin's 2 rooms. There's a bedroom through that door. It has a bed and clean linens. You'll sleep there tonight. I'll sleep out here by the fire. Mr. Brennan, I can't take your bed. It's not my bed. Jack cut her off, the words coming out sharper than he intended. It was my wife's bed. I haven't slept in it for 5 years. Don't argue with me about it. The silence that followed was heavy with things unsaid. Finally, Emma nodded. Thank you. Can you walk? She stood up carefully, testing her feet. Jack saw her wince, but she stayed upright. Yes, I can walk. Then go get some rest. We'll talk more in the morning. Emma moved toward the bedroom, her steps slow and careful. She paused at the doorway and turned back. Mr. Brennan, that thing you said earlier, about making me eat the whole pot of stew, I know you were talking about food, but thank you for clarifying anyway. Jack felt heat rise to his face. What did you think I meant? She gave him a look that was part exhaustion, part dark humor. I've learned that when men make threatening statements, it's best to assume the worst and be pleasantly surprised when you're wrong. Jack opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. There was a story there, one he suspected he wouldn't like when he finally heard it. Ma'am, I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of, but forcing myself on women isn't one of them. Never has been, never will be. You're safe here. I give you my word on that. Something in Emma's face softened. I believe you, Mr. Brennan. Good night. She disappeared into the bedroom, closing the door quietly behind her. Jack stood there in the firelight, trying to process everything that had just happened. An hour ago, he'd been alone with his ghosts and his regrets, planning to weather the storm in solitude. Now there was a woman in Ruth's bedroom, a woman who'd nearly died getting here. A woman he'd invited to come and then told not to come. A woman who was apparently fleeing from some kind of danger that she hadn't fully explained yet. He moved to the window and looked out at the storm. It was getting worse if that was possible. Visibility was down to nothing now, just white chaos in every direction. Emma's horse was out there somewhere, dead or dying. The woman herself would be dead too if she'd kept walking past his cabin instead of stopping. Jack returned to his chair by the fire and sat down heavily. His mind went to the graves up on the hill buried under snow now. Ruth and their daughter. 5 years of grief that he'd wrapped around himself like armor, keeping everyone and everything at a distance. Ruth, I don't know what I'm doing, the thought came unbidden. I don't know how to do this, how to have someone else in this house, how to talk to someone who isn't a ghost. The fire popped and crackled. The wind howled, and Jack Brennan sat alone with his thoughts while a stranger slept in his dead wife's bed. Dawn came late and gray, the storm still raging with undiminished fury. Jack had slept fitfully in his chair, waking every hour or so to add wood to the fire and check that the cabin wasn't developing any leaks or drafts. Old habits from the war. Sleep light, stay alert, be ready for trouble. He heard movement from the bedroom around 7 o'clock. Soft footsteps, then the door opening slowly. Emma emerged looking considerably better than she had the night before. Her hair was still disheveled and her dress was wrinkled, but her color was better and she was moving without the careful hesitation of someone in pain. Morning, ma'am. Jack was already at the stove making coffee. How are the feet and hands sore? But better, thank you. She moved to the window and looked out at the white chaos. How long do you think this will last? 2 days? Maybe 3. Jack poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one. We're stocked for a week if we need to be. Food, firewood, water. You picked a good place to nearly freeze to death. Emma accepted the coffee, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. I didn't see much choice in the matter. Fair point. They stood there in awkward silence, drinking coffee, not looking at each other. Finally, Jack cleared his throat. Ma'am, I think we need to have a conversation about what happens after this storm passes. I agree. Emma set her cup down on the table and faced him directly. Mr. Brennan, I told you last night that I needed to escape a dangerous situation. I think you deserve to know more than that. Jack pulled out a chair and sat down, gesturing for her to do the same. She did, folding her hands in her lap in a way that suggested she'd been trained in proper deportment. My late husband was named Thomas Hartwell. He was 45 when we married. I was 24. It wasn't a love match. I was a teacher with no family and no prospects. He was a widower who wanted companionship in his final years. We had an understanding. I would care for him, manage his household, and in return, he would provide for me. She paused, taking a breath. Thomas died 2 years ago. He left me his estate. It wasn't large, about $15,000 in total, but it was enough to live on modestly. His will was very clear. Everything went to me, except his brother Marcus disagreed. He argued that as the only male Hartwell he should have inherited. He took me to court. We fought for a year before the judge ruled in my favor. The will was ironclad. I won. Jack watched her face carefully. That should have been the end of it. It should have been. Emma's voice went quiet, but Marcus didn't accept it. He started coming by the house. At first it was just to talk, he said, to make sure I was managing the finances properly. Then his visits became more frequent. He started suggesting that the obvious solution was for us to marry. That way the money would stay in the family and I would have a man to protect me. I refused. Multiple times. Each time I refused, he became more insistent. Then one night about 2 months ago, he came to the house after dark. He'd been drinking, he forced his way inside, and he made it very clear that he was done asking. Jack's hands clenched into fists on the table. Did he hurt you? Emma's eyes met his, and Jack saw steel there, beneath the proper Boston manners. He tried. I hit him with the fireplace poker, hard enough to knock him down and give myself time to run. I locked myself in my bedroom until morning. Then I packed what I could carry, withdrew as much money from the bank as they would give me without notice, and left Boston on the first train west. I saw the advertisement for the matrimonial agency in a newspaper in Chicago. It seemed like the best option. Go somewhere far enough away that Marcus couldn't follow. Marry someone who would have legal claim to protect me. Start over. She looked down at her hands. I didn't tell you any of this in my letters because I thought you would refuse if you knew I was bringing trouble with me. I'm sorry for that deception. But I was desperate. Jack stood up and walked to the window, needing to move, needing to process what he'd just heard. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the landscape. Inside, his mind was working through the implications. This Marcus, is he the kind of man who gives up easily? Numbered Emma's voice was firm. He's a lawyer. He's methodical and persistent, and he doesn't like losing. Jack turned back to face her. Ma'am, I need to be straight with you about something. You asked me last night why I canceled our arrangement. The truth is, I got scared. Scared of having another woman in this house. Scared of trying to move past Ruth. Scared of a lot of things. He moved back to the table and sat down. But I'm not scared of men like your Marcus. I've dealt with worse. And I've got principles about how things should be done. A man forcing a woman trying to take what isn't his, that goes against everything I was raised to believe. Emma was watching him carefully. What are you saying, Mr. Brennan? I'm saying you can stay here. At least until we figure out if this Marcus fellow is going to come looking for you. And if he does well, we'll deal with that when it happens. That's very generous. But I can't just be a burden on your hospitality. I meant what I said. I can work. I can earn my keep. Jack studied her for a long moment. She was small, probably wouldn't weigh more than 100 pounds soaking wet. City-bred and refined. Nothing in her background suggested she knew the first thing about ranch work. But there was determination in her eyes, a stubbornness that suggested she'd push herself past her limits to prove she wasn't useless. Can you cook? Yes. Better than I can, probably. Can you clean? Of course. Sew men clothes. I was a teacher, Mr. Brennan. I lived on a teacher's salary. I learned to make do. Fair enough. Jack made a decision. Here's what we'll do. You stay here, help with the household work. I'll teach you ranch work if you're interested in learning. In return, you get room and board and protection if your brother-in-law shows up. No marriage required. Just a practical arrangement between two people who both need something. Emma nodded slowly. And if he doesn't show up, if I've dragged you into this for nothing, then you've got time to figure out what you want to do next. Head back east if you want. Stay in Montana if you prefer. Your choice. A thought occurred to Jack. This money you withdrew from the bank. How much? $3,000. It's sewn into the lining of my coat. Jesus Christ, woman. You've been carrying $3,000 around in your coat. It seems safer than leaving it behind. Jack ran a hand through his hair. All right, first thing we do when this storm passes is get that money to a bank. Sweetwater's got one. Not fancy, but it's secure. They sat in silence for a moment, the terms of their new arrangement settling between them. Finally, Emma spoke. Mr. Brennan, can I ask you something? Depends on the question. Last night, you said you'd done things you weren't proud of. What did you mean Jack had been expecting this question eventually? He just hadn't expected it quite so soon. How much do you know about the war between the states? I know it happened. I know it was terrible. I fought in it, enlisted in '62 when I was 17 years old, fought at Shiloh, Vicksburg, Atlanta, saw things no man should see, did things no man should have to do. He touched the scar on his face unconsciously. Got this at Shiloh. Confederate officer caught me with his saber. Would have killed a Bowman if his horse hadn't stumbled. As it was, I was lucky to survive. Is that what you're not proud of, fighting in the war? Number? Jack met her eyes. What I'm not proud of is why I enlisted in the first place. He stood up and walked to the window again, staring out at the storm. Before the war, I lived in Kansas City. My name wasn't Jackson Brennan. It was James McCarty. I was 17 years old and stupid and full of anger. Got into a fight with a man in a saloon. He said something about my mother. I hit him. He went down wrong, cracked his skull on the corner of the bar. Jack's voice went flat. He died. I killed him. And instead of staying to face the consequences, I ran. Changed my name, enlisted under a false identity, and spent the next 3 years trying to outrun what I'd done. He turned to face Emma. So that's what you need to know about me, Mrs. Hartwell. I'm a wanted man. There's still a warrant out for James McCarty in Missouri for murder. And if your brother-in-law decides to dig into my past, that's what he's going to find. Emma sat very still, processing this information. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. You were 17, defending your mother's honor. The man's death was an accident. The law doesn't see it that way. Perhaps the law is wrong sometimes. Jack gave her a sharp look. You're taking this remarkably well. Mr. Brennan, I just told you that I assaulted my brother-in-law with a fireplace poker and fled across the country with stolen money. I'm not exactly in a position to judge your past choices. The corner of Jack's mouth twitched. That might have been the beginning of a smile. Fair point. Outside, the wind shifted, sending a fresh barrage of snow against the windows. The storm showed no signs of letting up. They were trapped here together, two people with complicated pasts and uncertain futures, making an arrangement that might last a week or might last considerably longer. Jack moved to the stove to start preparing breakfast. "Can you make biscuits?" Mrs. Hartwell. Emma stood up and joined him. "I can. And please call me Emma. If we're going to be living under the same roof, formality seems excessive." Jack handed her a bowl and the flour tin. "All right, Emma. In that case, you should call me Jack." "Jack it is." They worked in companionable silence, Emma mixing biscuits while Jack fried eggs and bacon. The domesticity of it felt strange to Jack after years of solitary meals. But it wasn't unpleasant, just different. The biscuits came out better than any Jack had made in years, light and fluffy with that perfect golden brown top. He ate 4 of them with butter and honey, while Emma picked at one still recovering from her ordeal. After breakfast, Jack showed Emma around the cabin. It wasn't large. The main room served as kitchen, dining room, and sitting area. There were 2 bedrooms, the one Emma had slept in, and a smaller one that Jack had turned into storage. There was a root cellar for food storage and a small lean-to attached to the back where Jack kept tools and supplies. This was Ruth's room. Jack stood in the doorway of the main bedroom, not quite willing to step inside. She made those quilts herself, the curtains too. Everything in here was hers. Emma touched one of the quilts gently. She was very talented. She was practical. Ruth didn't believe in wasting time on things that weren't useful. Those quilts kept us warm through 5 winters. The curtains kept out the drafts. Jack turned away. "The room's yours for as long as you're here. I sleep out by the fire. Always have since she passed. May I ask how she died childbirth? Her and the baby both." He said it matter-of-factly the way he'd learned to say it, keeping the emotion locked down where it couldn't hurt him. 5 years ago this past December. I'm sorry. So am I." They moved back to the main room. The storm showed no signs of abating. Jack checked the firewood supply and decided they were fine for another day at least. Emma settled into the spare chair with a book she'd pulled from her bag. Jack noticed it was a worn copy of Great Expectations. He settled into his own chair with the knife and piece of wood he'd been working on for the past week, carving it into a handle for a new mallet. They spent the day in quiet companionship, each absorbed in their own tasks, occasionally exchanging a few words, but mostly comfortable with silence. It was easier than Jack had expected, having another person in his space. Maybe because Emma seemed to understand that silence wasn't always uncomfortable. Sometimes it was just peaceful. Evening came early. The storm darkened, sky fading from gray to black. Jack made dinner, another pot of the venison stew with fresh biscuits. They ate by firelight, the lamp oil being too precious to waste when the fire gave sufficient light. After dinner, Emma washed the dishes while Jack checked the cabin's exterior, making sure the storm hadn't damaged anything. When he came back inside stamping snow off his boots, he found Emma standing in front of the small shelf that held Jack's few books. "You have a copy of the Iliad," she sounded surprised. "My father's. He was a school teacher before he died. Believed every man should know the classics. Have you read it 3 times? Jack hung up his coat. "Once before the war, because my father made me. Twice after, because I finally understood what Homer was saying about the nature of war and the cost of glory." Emma pulled the book down and opened it carefully. "Would you mind if I read it? Help yourself." She returned to her chair and began to read while Jack went back to his carving. The firelight played across her face, highlighting the fine bones of her cheeks and the slight upturn of her nose. She was pretty, Jack realized with a start. Not beautiful in the way Ruth had been beautiful, but pretty in a quieter way. He looked away quickly, focusing on his work. He had no business noticing such things. The night wore on. Outside, the storm continued its assault. Inside, 2 people who were still strangers to each other sat by the fire, each lost in their own thoughts, each wondering what the future held once the storm finally passed. And up on the hill beneath the snow, Ruth Brennan lay in her grave, her promise to love Jack forever carved into wood that would one day rot away, leaving nothing but memory behind. Meanwhile, in Boston, 3 weeks earlier, Marcus Hartwell sat in the office of a private detective, his face still bearing the faint bruise from where Emma had struck him with the poker. The detective spread a map across the desk. "I traced her to Cheyenne, a matrimonial agency. Records show she's matched with a rancher in Montana Territory. Man named Jackson Brennan lives outside a town called Sweetwater. Marcus leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Montana. That's what 3 weeks of travel at least, maybe 4 with the winter weather. The detective tapped the map. She'll be well settled by the time you get there. That's fine. Marcus's smile was cold and calculating. I'm a patient man. And Emma can't hide forever. She has something that belongs to me and I intend to get it back. Just the money, Marcus's eyes hardened. The money. And something else. My late brother kept certain documents. Evidence of business dealings that if they were to surface would be inconvenient for me. Emma has those documents. The detective raised an eyebrow. Inconvenient? Let's just say they could result in a lengthy prison sentence if the wrong people saw them. Marcus stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the Boston streets below. My brother was a fool. He discovered some financial irregularities in our family business, and instead of discussing them with me privately, he documented everything. Names, dates, amounts, enough to ruin me. And you think Mrs. Hartwell has these documents? I know she does. I've searched every inch of Thomas's house, and they're not there. Emma must have found them and taken them when she fled. Marcus turned back to face the detective. Book me passage on the next train west. I'll handle this personally. You sure that's wise? Montana's a long way from Boston. Different rules out there. I'm a lawyer. I know how to work within the rules wherever I am. And if the rules don't work, Marcus's voice went cold. Well, I have other resources. The detective nodded slowly. I'll make the arrangements, but be careful, Mr. Hartwell. From what I've learned about this Jackson Brennan, he's not a man to be trifled with. Former soldier keeps to himself reputation for being dangerous. I'm not worried about some backwater cowboy. Marcus moved to the door. Make the arrangements. I leave in 3 days. Back in Montana, the storm finally broke on the 3rd day, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow lay thick across the landscape, sculpting the familiar terrain into something alien and beautiful. The sun came out for the first time in 72 hours, turning the frozen expanse into a field of diamonds that hurt to look at directly. Jack stood on the porch surveying his land with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to read weather and landscape like some men read books. The drifts were deep, some of them reaching halfway up the barn walls. It would take days to dig out properly, weeks before the roads were passable again. But the immediate danger had passed. Behind him, the cabin door opened, and Emma stepped out, wrapped in one of Ruth's old shawls. She'd found it in the bedroom, and Jack had told her to take whatever she needed. The dead had no use for warm clothing, and the living did. It's beautiful. Her voice carried a note of wonder. I've never seen so much snow. Jack grunted. Beautiful until you have to work in it. I need to check on the cattle, make sure none of them got trapped or injured. Then I'll dig out a path to the barn and check on the horses. Can I help? He looked at her doubtfully. She was still wearing the dress she'd arrived in, wholly unsuitable for ranch work. Her boots, while well-made, were designed for Boston streets, not Montana snow. Not dressed like that, you can't. He considered for a moment. Ruth was taller than you, but we might be able to make some of her work clothes fit. Trousers, heavy shirt, wool socks, and I've got an extra coat that'll swallow you whole, but it'll keep you warm. Emma's eyes lit up with something that might have been relief or eagerness or both. I'd appreciate that. 20 minutes later, she emerged from the bedroom, transformed. Ruth's trousers had to be rolled up at the ankles and cinched tight at the waist with a belt, but they fit well enough. The shirt hung loose but layered under Jack's spare coat. She looked almost like a ranch hand. A very small ranch hand who would probably blow away in a stiff breeze, but it was an improvement. Jack handed her a pair of heavy gloves. Stay close to me. Step where I step. The snow's deep enough to hide all kinds of trouble. Holes, rocks, debris. Break your ankle out here and it's a long, cold crawl back to the cabin. I understand. They set out together, Jack breaking trail with his long strides, Emma following in his footsteps. The cattle were in the lower pasture sheltered by the ridge and a stand of pines that had caught the worst of the snow. Jack counted them carefully, looking for any that might be down or separated from the herd. 17, all accounted for. He felt the tension ease from his shoulders. In weather like this, losing even one animal could mean the difference between a profitable year and a lean one. Emma was watching the cattle with interest. They're smaller than I expected. Good breeding stock. Not the biggest, but hardy. They can survive winters that would kill fancy eastern cattle. That's what matters out here. Survival. They made their way to the barn next. The horses, a big sorrel gelding named Red and a smaller paint mare called Daisy, greeted them with soft nickers. Jack checked them over carefully, running his hands along their legs, checking their hooves, making sure the cold hadn't caused any injuries. Emma stood back watching. When Jack was satisfied, he gestured her forward. Come here, I'll show you how to check them properly. A horse can't tell you when something's wrong. You have to learn to read the signs. He guided her through the process, showing her what to look for. Swelling in the joints, heat that might indicate inflammation, changes in temperament that could signal pain. Emma listened intently, asking intelligent questions, her hands gentle on Daisy's neck. You're good with her, Jack observed. Ever worked with horses before? A little. When I was young, before my parents died, we had a small farm. I helped with the animals. That was a long time ago, though. It's like reading. Once you learn, you don't forget. They worked together to muck out the stalls and lay down fresh hay. Emma handled the pitchfork awkwardly at first, but she didn't complain about the hard work or the smell. Jack found himself reassessing her. City-bred she might be, but she wasn't afraid of labor. By the time they made it back to the cabin, the sun was high and both of them were sweating despite the cold. Emma's cheeks were flushed with exertion, and cold air, her eyes bright. She looked more alive than she had since arriving. That was harder than I expected, she admitted as she hung up the coat. But satisfying. That's ranch work. Hard but honest. You know at the end of the day what you've accomplished. Jack started preparing lunch while Emma changed back into her dress. When she emerged, she immediately began setting the table, moving around the kitchen with growing familiarity. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that settles between people who are starting to learn each other's rhythms. After lunch, Jack announced his intention to ride into Sweetwater. I need to let folks know I'm still alive, and we need to get your money to the bank before you lose it or someone steals it. Emma paled slightly. Do you think Marcus could have followed me here already? Not likely, but I don't believe in taking chances. Besides, if he is coming better, that people in town know about it. Sweetwater looks after its own. The ride to town took 2 hours through the heavy snow. Jack rode Red and Emma rode behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance. It was the closest they'd been since he'd carried her into the cabin that first night. Jack tried not to think about how small she felt, how fragile, or how she fit against his back like she belonged there. Sweetwater was a small town, maybe 300 souls when everyone was counted. It consisted of one main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, a blacksmith shop, a doctor's office, and a handful of other businesses. The bank was a solid brick building that looked out of place among the rougher wooden structures, a testament to someone's optimism about the town's future. Jack helped Emma down from the horse and tied Red to the hitching post. Several people on the street stopped to stare. Jack Brennan rarely came to town, and he'd certainly never been seen with a woman before. Let them look, Jack said quietly, seeing Emma's discomfort. Small town, not much happens. We're the most interesting thing they've seen all winter. They entered the bank together. The clerk, a nervous young man named Timothy Walsh, nearly fell out of his chair when he saw Jack. Mr. Brennan, what can I do for you? This is Mrs. Emma Hartwell. She needs to open an account. Timothy's eyes went wide with curiosity, but he was professional enough to keep his questions to himself. Of course, if you'll just fill out these forms. Emma removed the money from her coat lining while Jack stood guard by the door watching the street. $3,000 was more money than most people in Sweetwater saw in 5 years. News of it would spread fast, and not everyone in the territory was honest. The transaction completed, they left the bank and headed for the blacksmith shop. Henry Walsh was Jack's closest friend, the only person in town who'd bothered to see past Jack's size and scars to the man underneath. Henry's shop was warm and loud, the ringing of hammer on anvil of familiar music. The blacksmith looked up from his work and broke into a wide grin when he saw Jack. Well, I'll be damned, thought maybe the storm had finally carried you off. Henry set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his apron. Then his gaze shifted to Emma, and his eyebrows rose. And who might this be? Henry Walsh, meet Emma Hartwell. My wife. The lie came out before Jack had fully thought it through. But once spoken, he realized it made sense. Emma needed protection, needed legitimacy. A wife had rights that a house guest didn't. And if Marcus came looking, the marriage would complicate his plans considerably. Henry's eyebrows climbed even higher, but he was quick enough to play along. Your wife? Well, congratulations are in order, I suppose. He extended a calloused hand to Emma. Pleased to meet you, ma'am. And you, Mr. Walsh. Just Henry, please. Any friend of Jack's is a friend of mine. After they left the blacksmith shop, Emma grabbed Jack's arm. Why did you tell him we were married? Because if your brother-in-law comes looking, that's going to be our story. Easier if everyone believes it from the start. Jack looked down at her. Unless you object. Emma considered for a moment. No, I don't object. It's practical. But shouldn't we make it legal if Marcus challenges it? Jack felt something tighten in his chest. You want to actually marry me? I want to be protected from Marcus. If that means marrying you, then yes. She met his gaze steadily. You said yourself it's practical. Jack thought of Ruth buried on the hill, thought of the vows he'd made to her, promises to love her forever. But Ruth was dead and Emma was alive, and sometimes a man had to choose the living over the dead. All right, we'll see the pastor before we leave town. Pastor James Daniels was a weathered man in his 60s who'd been ministering to Sweetwater since before the war. He greeted Jack with warmth and Emma with polite curiosity. Jack Brennan, it's been too long since I've seen you in church. I know, Pastor. I'm sorry, but I've come today because I need you to perform a marriage. The pastor's eyes sharpened with interest. A marriage to this young lady. Yes, sir, this is Emma Hartwell, from Boston. We've been corresponding through a matrimonial agency. She arrived a few days ago. Pastor Daniels studied them both carefully. Marriage is a sacred covenant, Mr. Brennan, not something to be entered into lightly. Have you both considered this carefully? We have. Jack's voice was steady. We understand what we're doing. Very well. I'll need 2 witnesses. Jack went back to fetch Henry from his shop. The blacksmith brought his wife Martha, a plump woman with kind eyes who ran the boarding house on the edge of town. The ceremony was brief and simple. Pastor Daniels asked the traditional questions. Do you, Jackson Brennan, take Emma Hartwell to be your lawfully wedded wife? Do you promise to love, honor, and cherish her in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live? Jack looked at Emma standing beside him in Ruth's borrowed clothes, her hand small in his. He thought about promises and vows and the weight of words spoken in front of God and witnesses. I do. And do you, Emma Hartwell, take Jackson Brennan to be your lawfully wedded husband? Do you promise to love, honor, and cherish him in sickness and in health for as long as you both shall live? Emma's voice didn't waver. I do. Then by the power vested in me, by the territory of Montana, and the grace of God, I pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Brennan, you may kiss your bride. Jack hesitated. They hadn't discussed this part, but Emma solved the problem by rising on her toes and pressing a brief, chaste kiss to his cheek. Martha clapped her hands together. Oh, how lovely. You must let me host a proper celebration once the weather clears. That's very kind, ma'am. Emma's voice was warm but non-committal. They signed the marriage certificate. Henry and Martha witnessed it, and just like that, Jack Brennan had a wife again. It felt surreal, like something happening to someone else. They walked back to the horse in silence. Are you all right? Emma asked quietly. Jack helped her mount Red before swinging up behind her. I don't know. Ask me again in a few days. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in thought. The sun was setting by the time they arrived, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Jack helped Emma down and they stood together for a moment looking at the cabin. This is your home now, Jack said. For better or worse, it's yours. Emma turned to look at him, her face serious in the fading light. I'll try to be worthy of it. They went inside together. The cabin felt different now, though Jack couldn't quite say how. Maybe it was just knowing that Emma wasn't a temporary guest anymore. She was his wife. The thought was strange and unsettling and oddly comforting on one end. That night they sat by the fire after dinner, the same way they had for the past 3 nights. But now there was a new awareness between them, a consciousness of the vows they'd spoken and what they might mean. Jack. Emma's voice was soft. Can I ask you something? This depends on the question. Do you regret it, marrying me? Jack was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. No, not yet anyway. Ask me again if your brother-in-law shows up and makes my life hell. Emma smiled slightly. That's fair. She paused. Can I tell you something? Go ahead. I'm glad I came here, despite everything, despite the storm and nearly freezing to death. I'm glad. Why, because for the first time in 2 years, I began to feel afraid. I don't feel like I'm waiting for something terrible to happen. Here with you, I feel safe. Jack felt something shift in his chest, a crack in the armor he'd built around himself. Safe. Such a simple thing to want. Such a hard thing to find. I'll do my best to keep you that way. It was the only promise he could make. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Jack taught Emma the rhythms of ranch life. How to read the weather by looking at the sky and feeling the wind. How to check the cattle without spooking them. How to mend tack and repair fences. She learned quickly, her city refinement giving way to a practical competence that surprised them both. In return, Emma brought order to the cabin. She cleaned corners that hadn't been touched in 5 years. She mended Jack's clothes, which had been held together by increasingly creative patches. She cooked meals that were more elaborate than the simple fare Jack had been living on, using the supplies in his pantry to create dishes that reminded him there was pleasure to be found in food. And slowly, carefully, they began to talk. Real conversations that went beyond the practical necessities of daily life. Emma told him about her childhood on a small farm in Pennsylvania, about losing her parents to fever when she was 12, about the years spent as a governess in wealthy households, where she'd been neither family nor servant, but something uncomfortably in between. Jack told her about the war, about not the glory and heroism that people like to imagine, but the reality. The mud and the fear and the way men screamed when they were dying. The friends he'd lost, the things he'd done that still woke him up at night. He told her about Ruth, too, how they'd met at a church social in Kansas City after the war, how she'd been the first person who'd looked at him and seen a man instead of a monster, how they'd married within 3 months and headed west to start fresh. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman. Emma said one evening as they sat by the fire. She was practical, like you, not given to romantic notions. She knew life was hard and she faced it head on. Do I remind you of her? Jack considered the question carefully. No, you're different. Softer in some ways, harder in others, but you've got the same strength underneath. The same refusal to quit when things get difficult. Emma looked pleased by the comparison. In the third week after the wedding, Jack woke from a nightmare. He was back at Shiloh watching Corporal James Davies take a Confederate bullet meant for Jack, watching his friend's blood soak into the Tennessee mud, hearing Davies' last words. Tell my ma I was brave, Jack. Tell her I was brave. Jack sat up gasping, his heart pounding, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cold. It took him a moment to remember where he was. The cabin, Montana, home. Jack Emma's voice came from the bedroom doorway. Are you all right? Fine. Just a dream. Go back to sleep. But she didn't. She crossed the room and knelt beside his chair. You're not fine. You're shaking. I said I'm fine. The words came out harsher than he intended. Emma didn't flinch. She reached out and took his hand. Talk to me. And somehow the words came. He told her about Davies, about the guilt he carried for being alive when better men had died, about the nights when he could still smell gunpowder and blood, could still hear the screams of the wounded. Emma listened without judgment, her hand steady in his. When he finished, she said quietly, You carry too much weight alone. A man carries what he has to. Not always. Sometimes he can share the burden. That's what partners do. Is that what we are, partners? Aren't we? Jack looked at her, this woman who'd stumbled into his life during a blizzard and somehow become essential to it. Yes, I suppose we are. Emma stood up. Move over. What? Move over. Make room. Jack shifted in the chair, confused. Emma settled in beside him, tucking herself against his side. She was warm and solid and real. What are you doing? Sharing the burden. Now go back to sleep. I'll keep watch. Jack wanted to protest to maintain the careful distance they'd established, but he was exhausted and she was warm, and for the first time in 5 years, he didn't want to be alone with his ghosts. He closed his eyes and let himself drift, Emma's steady breathing a counterpoint to the crackling fire. When he woke in the morning, she was still there. Things changed after that night, not dramatically, but in small, significant ways. They sat closer together by the fire. They lingered over meals, talking long after the food was gone. Jack found himself looking forward to the end of the day, to the time when work was done and they could simply be together. He was falling in love with her. The realization came to him one afternoon while watching her hanging laundry on the line he'd strung between the cabin and the barn. She was singing something he couldn't make out the words, and the wind was whipping her dark hair around her face. She looked so alive, so present, and Jack felt something in his chest that he'd thought had died with Ruth. He was falling in love with Emma Hartwell Brennan, his practical wife of convenience, and he had no idea what to do about it. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Emma reading while Jack worked on carving a new fence post, she looked up suddenly. "Jack, there's something I need to tell you." He set down his knife. "What is it? I wasn't entirely honest with you about my situation with Marcus." Jack went very still. "Go on." "The money Thomas left me, the $15,000. That's not the only reason Marcus wants me." She took a deep breath. Before Thomas died, he discovered that Marcus had been embezzling from the family business. $30,000 over the course of 5 years. Thomas documented everything. Names, dates, amounts. He was planning to turn Marcus over to the authorities. And then Thomas died. Suddenly, of what the doctor called a heart condition. Emma's voice was steady, but Jack heard the tremor underneath. "I've never been entirely convinced it was natural. You think Marcus killed him?" "I don't know. I can't prove anything. But Thomas was healthy one day and dead the next, and Marcus was the one who found him. And conveniently, most of Thomas's documentation disappeared. Most of it, but not all. You have evidence." Emma stood up and went to the bedroom. She returned with a small leather journal. "Thomas kept this separate from his other records. It has enough information to send Marcus to prison for 20 years, maybe more." She handed it to Jack. He opened it carefully, scanning the neat columns of numbers and notes. It was damning, absolutely damning. "Does Marcus know you have this? I think he suspects. I found it in Thomas's study after the funeral, hidden in a false bottom of his desk drawer. Marcus searched the house several times, always claiming he was looking for important business documents. But I'd already moved it. That's why he's so determined to find you. Not just for the money, but to destroy the evidence." "Yes," Emma met his eyes. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you before. I was afraid you'd refuse to help if you knew how much danger I was bringing to your door." Jack closed the journal and handed it back to her. "How much danger are we talking about? If Marcus finds me, he'll do whatever it takes to get this journal. He's already tried violence once. I don't think he'll hesitate to try again." Jack stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening landscape. The snow had mostly melted in the lower elevations, though it still clung to the shadows in the high country. The roads would be passable soon, which meant Marcus could come looking anytime now. "Right," he turned back to face Emma. "Here's what we're going to do. Tomorrow we ride to Helena. There's a federal judge there, a man named Harrison. I met him during the war. He's honest, which is rare enough, and he owes me a favor. We give him the journal and let the law handle Marcus. What if Marcus gets here before we can leave? Then we handle him ourselves." Jack moved to the gun cabinet and pulled out his Winchester rifle. He checked it over carefully, then did the same with his Colt revolver. "I told you before, I've dealt with worse than men like your Marcus, and I told you I'd keep you safe. I meant it." Emma's eyes shone with unshed tears. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. We're not out of this." That night, Jack didn't sleep. He sat by the window with his rifle across his knees, watching the road. Emma tried to stay up with him, but exhaustion claimed her around midnight. Jack carried her to the bedroom and tucked her in, then returned to his vigil. The attack came just before dawn. Jack heard them before he saw them. 3 horses moving fast up the road from town. He was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand. "Emma," he spoke quietly but urgently. Emma, wake up." She emerged from the bedroom, eyes wide with alarm. "What is it, company?" 3 riders. Stay in the bedroom and don't come out unless I call for you." "But Jack, I can't just leave you to face them alone." "Yes, you can, and you will." He met her eyes. "I've been in more fights than I can count. This is what I know how to do. Trust me." Emma nodded reluctantly and retreated to the bedroom. Jack heard the door close and the scrape of furniture being moved. She was barricading herself in. Good. The riders pulled up in front of the cabin. Through the window, Jack could see them clearly in the pre-dawn light. The man in front was wearing an expensive coat and hat, city clothes that marked him as an outsider. Marcus Hartwell, unless Jack missed his guess. The 2 men with him were rougher sorts, hired muscle by the look of them. Jack opened the door and stepped onto the porch, rifle held loosely but ready. "Morning, gentlemen. You're a long way from Boston." Marcus dismounted smoothly. "Mr. Brennan, I presume." "I'm Marcus Hartwell. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Your sister-in-law is a grown woman who can make her own decisions. She's decided to stay here with her husband. Marcus's smile was cold, a convenient marriage performed in haste to evade the law. I've already spoken with my attorneys. It can be annulled. Not in Montana, it can't. Jack's voice was flat. We're legally married under territorial law. That makes Emma my wife and her business my business. Now I suggest you turn those horses around and head back the way you came. I'm afraid I can't do that. Marcus gestured to his companions. These are Mr. Cole and Mr. Briggs. They're here to help me reclaim property that was stolen from the Hartwell estate. The one called Cole was a lean man with a gunfighter's eyes and a tied-down holster. Briggs was bigger, built like a bull with hands that looked like they'd broken bones before. There's no stolen property here, just my wife and her legal inheritance. You've got no claim to either one. Marcus's facade of civility cracked. You think I don't know what you are, Brennan? I've done my research. James McCarty wanted for murder in Missouri since 1862. One telegram to the right authorities, and you'll be on your way to a noose. Jack felt cold settle into his bones. So that's your play. Threaten me with my past hope. I'll hand over Emma to save my own neck. It's a generous offer, really. Marcus pulled a folded paper from his coat. This is a copy of your arrest warrant, quite detailed. But if you cooperate, if you send Emma out here right now with Thomas's journal, I'll conveniently forget I ever saw it. And if I don't, then Cole here will ride to Sweetwater and deliver it to the sheriff. You'll be arrested before noon. And while you're sitting in a cell waiting to be extradited to Missouri, I'll come back for Emma. Without you here to protect her, she'll have no choice but to cooperate. Jack considered his options. Marcus had clearly thought this through. He had leverage and muscle, and he wasn't bluffing about the warrant. Jack could see it from here, official stamps and signatures. The real thing. But Jack had spent 3 years fighting a war and 5 years living on the edge of civilization. He'd learned that sometimes the only way to win was to flip the table and start a new game. Mr. Hartwell, I'm going to give you one chance to leave, right now. Get on your horses and ride away. Or what, you'll shoot us, that would be murder. And there are 3 of us and 1 of you. The bedroom window opened. Emma's voice rang out clear and strong. 2 of us. Jack's heart sank. Emma stood in the window with a shotgun, one of the old ones Jack kept for close-range work. She had it aimed squarely at Marcus. Emma, get back inside. No, she didn't take her eyes off Marcus. You're not doing this alone. Marcus laughed. How touching. But I don't think a woman who's never fired a gun in her life is much of a threat. Emma pulled the trigger. The shotgun boomed, and a chunk of ground exploded 3 feet in front of Marcus's horse. The animal reared, nearly throwing its rider. The next shot won't be a warning. Emma's voice was steady as she reloaded. Thomas taught me to shoot, and I'm a much better student than you ever gave me credit for. Jack used the distraction to bring his own rifle up, aimed at Cole. The gunfighter froze his hand, hovering near his pistol. Here's how this is going to work. Jack's voice cut through the tension. You're going to turn around and leave, all 3 of you, and you're not coming back. You're making a mistake. Marcus had recovered his seat, but his horse was dancing nervously. I'll have the law on you by nightfall, maybe, but you'll still be leaving, because if you try anything else, one of you is going to die. Maybe all 3, and I can promise you it won't be me or my wife. The standoff held for a long moment. Jack watched Cole carefully. The gunfighter was the real danger. Briggs might be strong, but he was slow. Marcus was a schemer, not a fighter. But Cole had the look of a man who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Finally, Marcus pulled his horse around. This isn't over, Brennan. Yes, it is. Jack didn't lower his rifle. Because we're leaving for Helena today. We're going to see Judge Harrison and hand over that journal you're so interested in. By tomorrow afternoon, there'll be federal warrants out for your arrest. Embezzlement, attempted murder, conspiracy. You'll spend the next 20 years in prison if they don't hang you. You can't prove any of that. Thomas's journal proves all of it. Names, dates, amounts. Everything a prosecutor needs. Marcus's face went white. You're bluffing. Emma spoke up. Thomas knew what you were, Marcus. He knew, and he documented it. The only reason he didn't turn you in while he was alive was because you were family. But he made sure the evidence survived him. Just in case. You murdered him. The accusation burst from Marcus. You poisoned him, and stole that journal. No, but you're welcome to make that accusation in court, under oath, in front of a judge who'll want to know why you're so interested in evidence of your own crimes. Cole's hand finally moved away from his gun. Mr. Hartwell, we should go. Marcus looked between Jack and Emma, his face twisted with rage and frustration. This isn't over. Yes, Jack said quietly. It is. Now ride out before I change my mind about letting you leave. They left the three horses kicking up snow as they galloped back toward town. Jack kept his rifle trained on them until they were out of sight. Then he lowered it slowly and turned to see Emma climbing out through the window, still holding the shotgun. I thought I told you to stay inside, and I thought we were partners. She set the shotgun down carefully. Partners don't let each other face danger alone. Jack wanted to be angry. She'd risked herself unnecessarily. But looking at her now, fierce and determined and wholly unrepentant, he felt only admiration. That was a hell of a shot. I was aiming for his horse, Emma admitted, but the effect was the same. Despite everything, Jack laughed. Come here. She walked into his arms and he held her, feeling her heartbeat racing against his chest. They stood like that for a long moment, the adrenaline slowly fading, replaced by the simple relief of being alive and together. We need to leave for Helena, Jack said finally. Today, before Marcus has time to regroup. I know. I'll pack. Emma. He pulled back to look at her. What you did out there, that took real courage. I was terrified. Courage isn't not being afraid, it's acting despite the fear. You did good. Her eyes shone. So did you. They packed quickly and efficiently. Jack saddled both horses while Emma gathered supplies for the journey. 2 hours after Marcus's departure, they were on the road to Helena. The journey took 3 days. They rode hard, stopping only to rest the horses and grab a few hours of sleep. Jack kept watch while Emma slept, his rifle always close at hand. On the second night, camped under the stars, Emma asked him the question he had been expecting. What happens after this? After we give the journal to Judge Harrison depends. Jack was whittling a piece of wood more out of habit than any real purpose. If Marcus is arrested, if the charges stick, then you're free. You can go wherever you want, do whatever you want. And if the charges don't stick, then we deal with that when it happens. That's not what I'm asking. Emma's voice was quiet but insistent. I'm asking about us. What happens to us? Jack set down his knife. I don't know. We got married for practical reasons. To protect you. Once Marcus is no longer a threat, those reasons go away. So we go our separate ways if that's what you want. Emma moved closer to him. What if it's not what I want? Jack's heart started beating faster. What are you saying? I'm saying that somewhere between freezing on your doorstep and facing down 3 men with a shotgun, this stopped being just a practical arrangement for me. She met his eyes. I care about you, Jack, more than I thought possible. More than is probably wise. Jack felt something crack inside him, the last of the walls he'd built around his heart, finally giving way. Emma, I can't promise you an easy life. I'm a wanted man with a dark past and a rough future. I live in the middle of nowhere doing hard work for little reward. I've got ghosts that wake me up at night and scars that'll never fully heal. I'm not asking for easy, I'm asking for real. For a partnership between two people who understand that life is hard and face it together anyway. Jack reached out and cupped her face in his hand. She leaned into the touch, her eyes never leaving his. I'm falling in love with you. The words came out rough, unpracticed. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to, but I am. Emma smiled and it transformed her face. Good, because I'm falling in love with you too. He kissed her, then not the chaste touch they'd shared at their wedding, but deep and real and full of all the things he couldn't put into words. She kissed him back with equal intensity, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jack rested his forehead against hers. I promise you, Emma Brennan, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you. You already do, she whispered. You already do. They reached Helena on the 3rd day. Judge William Harrison had chambers in the territorial courthouse, an imposing building that spoke of law and order in a land that had precious little of either. The judge was a tall man in his 60s with shrewd eyes and a face weathered by frontier living. He greeted Jack warmly. Brennan, I'll be damned. I heard you'd settled up in Sweetwater. It's been, what, 20 years about that? Jack shook his hand. I need your help, Judge. Must be serious if you came all this way. They laid out the whole story. Emma produced Thomas's journal and explained its contents. Jack filled in the details about Marcus's threats and the confrontation at the ranch. Judge Harrison listened carefully, occasionally asking pointed questions. When they finished, he sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers. This is quite serious. If these allegations are true, we're talking about major financial crimes. Possibly murder, though that would be harder to prove. Can you help us? Emma's voice was steady, but Jack could hear the tension underneath. I can issue a warrant for Marcus Hartwell's arrest based on this evidence. Whether he's convicted is up to a jury, but I can guarantee he'll face trial. And Emma glanced at her husband. Marcus has threatened to expose Jack's past. Judge Harrison turned his attention to Jack. The Kansas City matter. I'm aware of it. Jack felt his stomach drop. I made it my business to know when you settled in Montana. You saved my life at Shiloh Brennan. Took a saber meant for me. I figured I owed you the courtesy of knowing what skeletons might be in your closet. So you know I'm wanted for murder. I know you killed a man when you were 17 years old defending your mother's honor. I also know you've spent the last 23 years trying to make up for it. 3 years fighting for your country, 20 years building an honest life on the frontier. The judge leaned forward. I've looked at the case file, Brennan. With the right lawyer and the right testimony, a good argument could be made for justifiable homicide. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying that if Marcus Hartwell tries to use your past against you, I'll make damn sure the full context comes out, including witness statements I've managed to locate over the years from people who were in that saloon. People who saw the other man draw a knife first. Jack felt Emma's hand slip into his. He squeezed it gratefully. Why? Why would you do that for me? Because you're a good man who made a mistake as a boy and has spent his entire adult life trying to be better. The law should be about justice, not just punishment. You've more than paid your debt to society, in my judgment. The judge stood up and extended his hand. I'll issue the warrant for Marcus Hartwell today. With luck, we'll have him in custody within the week. As for you, Mr. Brennan, consider your record expunged. You're a free man. Jack shook the judge's hand, too overwhelmed to speak. Emma was crying quietly beside him, tears of relief streaming down her face. They left the courthouse in a daze. On the street outside, Jack stopped and turned to Emma. It's over. We're free. She threw her arms around him, and he held her close, feeling the weight of 23 years lift from his shoulders. They spent that night in Helena's best hotel, splurging on a real bed and a hot bath. Jack lay awake long after Emma had fallen asleep, watching her in the dim light from the street. He'd thought his life was over when Ruth died. Thought he'd used up all his chances at happiness. But here he was, holding a woman who'd walked through a blizzard and into his heart, who'd stood beside him against danger and never faltered. Maybe redemption wasn't something you earned. Maybe it was something you accepted when it was offered. A gift from a universe that occasionally took pity on broken men trying to do better. Jack pulled Emma closer and closed his eyes. For the first time in 5 years, he fell asleep without nightmares, without guilt, without the weight of the past crushing him. He fell asleep simply grateful. Grateful for second chances. Grateful for stubborn women who refused to give up. Grateful for love that came when you least expected it and needed it most. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, and the Montana night embraced them both. The telegram arrived 5 days after they returned from Helena. Jack was in the barn repairing a broken stall door when Emma came running across the yard, her skirts hitched up, waving a yellow slip of paper. Jack, it's from Judge Harrison. He set down his hammer and took the telegram, reading it quickly. Marcus Hartwell had been arrested in Cheyenne attempting to board an eastbound train. The evidence from Thomas's journal had been more than sufficient. Federal marshals were transporting him to Helena to stand trial. The charges were extensive embezzlement, conspiracy, attempted extortion, and the judge had added interference with a federal investigation. It's really over. Emma's voice was full of wonder. He can't hurt us anymore. Jack folded the telegram carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Looks that way. How do you feel, Strange? She turned to look back at the cabin, the barn, the land stretching out toward the mountains. I spent 2 years being afraid. And now I don't have to be anymore. It's like learning to breathe again. Jack pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. You're safe now. That's all that matters. They stood like that for a while, wrapped in each other, and the quiet satisfaction of danger averted. Then Emma pulled back and looked up at him with a mischievous smile. So now that we're not running from criminals or hiding from the law, what do we do? Live, Jack said simply. We just live. And living, it turned out, was harder and more wonderful than either of them had expected. Spring came to Montana in fits and starts, snow melting, to reveal brown grass that would soon turn green. The cattle grew restless, ready to be moved to higher pasture. The horses shed their winter coats in great clumps that Emma collected and spun into coarse yarn. The world was waking up, and so was the ranch. Jack threw himself into the work with renewed energy. There were fences to mend, irrigation ditches to clear, calves to brand. Emma worked beside him, learning the rhythms of ranch life with the same determination she'd brought to everything else. She learned to rope, though her throws were wild, and Jack had to bite back laughter more than once. She learned to ride properly, graduating from clinging to Jack's back to sitting her own saddle on Daisy. And in the evenings, they learned each other. They'd been married for 3 weeks, but the marriage had started as a practical arrangement, walls carefully maintained between them. Now those walls were coming down brick by brick, and they were discovering who they really were beneath the armor they'd each worn for so long. Emma told him about the loneliness of being a governess, always on the outside of families, caring for children who would never truly be hers. She told him about Thomas, a kind man who'd offered security, but not passion, comfort, but not joy. She told him about the years of feeling invisible, insignificant, a piece of furniture in someone else's life. Jack told her about the boy he'd been before the war, the son of a school teacher who'd dreamed of going to university and studying literature. He told her about watching that boy die at Shiloh, replaced by a soldier who learned to kill efficiently and sleep through artillery barrages. He told her about Ruth, but also about the guilt he'd carried for surviving when she hadn't, for being alive while she rotted in the ground. I spent 5 years punishing myself, he said one night as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. Living, but not really living. Going through the motions. I think part of me was afraid. Afraid that if I let myself be happy again, fate would punish me by taking it away. And now Emma's hand found his in the darkness. Now I'm starting to believe I deserve this. You, us, a future. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Good, because I'm not going anywhere. In late April, Henry Walsh rode out to the ranch with news. The town was planning a spring social, a celebration to mark the end of winter. There would be food and music and dancing. Everyone in Sweetwater and the surrounding ranches would be there. You should come. Henry directed this at Jack, though his eyes included Emma. Both of you, let people get to know Emma properly. Show them you are not the hermit everyone thinks you are. I don't dance, Jack said flatly. You did at your wedding to Ruth. I was there, remember? That was different. How Henry had him there. Jack looked at Emma, who was trying very hard not to look too interested. Do you want to go? Emma bit her lip. I don't want to push you into something you are not comfortable with. But yes, I'd like to meet more people. Make friends if possible. Jack sighed. Fine, we'll go. But I'm not wearing a suit. No one's asking you to wear a suit. Henry grinned. Just clean clothes and a pleasant expression would be a start. After Henry left, Emma practically glowed with excitement. She immediately began planning, going through her limited wardrobe to find something suitable. Jack watched her with amusement, in something deeper, a warmth in his chest that he was learning to recognize as simple happiness. The night of the social, Jack did his best to clean up. He shaved carefully, trying not to nick himself around the scar. He put on his best shirt, the one Emma had mended until it almost looked new. He even attempted to tame his hair with water and a comb, though it rebelled almost immediately. Emma emerged from the bedroom in a blue dress that Jack had never seen before. It wasn't fancy by Eastern standards, but it fit her perfectly, bringing out the warm tones in her skin and the depth of her brown eyes. You're beautiful. The words came out before he could stop them. She blushed. It's just an old dress. I've had it for years. You're still beautiful. The social was held in the church hall, an only building in Sweetwater, large enough to hold the entire community. Someone had strung lanterns from the rafters, casting warm light over tables laden with food. A small group of musicians in the corner were tuning their instruments, preparing for the dancing that would follow dinner. Jack felt every eye in the room turn to them as they entered. He resisted the urge to turn around and leave. Emma's hand tightened on his arm, whether for his comfort or her own, he couldn't tell. Martha Walsh bustled over immediately, enveloping Emma in a warm hug. "Oh, my dear, I'm so glad you came. Come, let me introduce you to the other ladies." Emma glanced at Jack, who nodded. "Go on, I'll be fine." He watched her disappear into a cluster of women already chattering and laughing. Henry appeared at his elbow with 2 cups of punch. "Relax, nobody's going to bite. That's what I'm afraid of. All this socializing. Good practice for you. You're part of a community, Jack, whether you like it or not." The evening progressed. Jack endured several conversations with ranchers he barely knew, discussing cattle prices and weather patterns and the new railroad spur that might be coming through next year. It was tedious, but not unbearable, and he found himself almost enjoying parts of it. He kept one eye on Emma throughout. She seemed to be thriving, moving from group to group with natural grace. He heard her laugh more than once, a sound that still had the power to catch him off guard with its pure joy. When the music started, Jack retreated to a corner, nursing his punch and watching couples move onto the makeshift dance floor. Emma was surrounded by admirers, ranch hands, too young to be married and too bold to be shama. She was polite, but clearly looking for someone else. When her eyes found Jack, her whole face lit up. She excused herself and made her way through the crowd to his corner. "Dance with me. I told you I don't dance. You told Henry you don't dance." "You didn't tell me." She held out her hand. "One dance, that's all I'm asking." Jack set down his cup and took her hand. "Just one. And if I step on your feet, don't say I didn't warn you." He led her onto the floor just as the musicians began a waltz. Jack placed one hand on her waist, took her other hand in his, and began to move. He was rusty, his steps awkward at first, but the rhythm came back to him. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Ruth had taught him this dance in a Missouri barn 15 years ago. Now he was dancing it with Emma in a Montana church hall, and somehow that felt right. "You lied," Emma said, looking up at him with mock accusation. "You can dance. I'm out of practice. You're doing fine." She leaned in closer. "Better than fine." They moved together in silence for a while, Jack acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched. Her hand in his palm on her waist, the warm scent of her hair, something floral he couldn't name. "Thank you," Emma said quietly, "for coming tonight. I know it wasn't easy for you. You wanted to come. That made it worth it. Still," she smiled, "I appreciate it. This feels like the first normal thing we've done since I arrived. No blizzards, no criminals, no danger. Just a dance. Normal might take some getting used to. We have time." The song ended and another began, this one faster. Jack started to lead Emma off the floor, but she pulled him back. "One more. You said one dance." "I lied." They danced 3 more songs before Jack finally begged for mercy, pleading exhaustion. In truth, his bad knee was starting to protest an old war injury that flared up when he pushed too hard. But it was worth it to see Emma so happy, her cheeks flushed and her eyes bright. They made their way to the food tables, sampling dishes brought by various families. Emma chatted easily with the women who approached, and Jack found himself drawn into conversations with men he'd been avoiding for years. The talk was easy, inconsequential, but it felt good to be part of something again. To be seen as a man with a we and a ranch instead of a dangerous hermit to be avoided. As the evening wore on, Jack found himself standing with Sheriff Murphy discussing the news from Helena about Marcus's arrest. Judge Harrison sent word that the trial's set for June. Murphy said, sipping his punch, "With the evidence Mrs. Brennan provided, it should be open and shut." "That's good news. There's more." Murphy lowered his voice. "The judge looked into that matter from your past, found evidence that changes the whole picture. Witness statements saying the other fellow drew a knife first. Self-defense clear as day." Jack felt something loosen in his chest. "So it's really over." "It is. You're a free man, Jack. Clean slate. After 23 years. Better late than never." Jack found Emma in the crowd and caught her eye. She smiled at him, radiant in the lamplight, and he felt a surge of gratitude so intense it almost hurt. This woman had walked into his life during a blizzard and changed everything. She'd given him a reason to hope again, to believe in futures instead of just surviving day to day. The ride home was quiet, both of them pleasantly tired. The moon was nearly full, turning the landscape silver and strange. Emma rode behind Jack on red, her arms around his waist, her head resting against his back. At the ranch, Jack helped her down and they stood together in the yard, neither quite ready to go inside and end the evening. "Thank you for tonight," Emma said again. "It meant a lot to me. It wasn't so bad," Jack admitted. "Might even do it again sometime." "Don't make promises you can't keep." "Who says I can't keep it?" Emma rose on her toes and kissed him soft and sweet and full of promise. When she pulled back, her eyes were serious. "Jack, there's something I want to talk to you about." "All right, this marriage of ours, it started as a convenience. Protection for me, companionship for you. But it's become something more. At least for me. For me too." "Good." She took a breath. "So I think we should stop treating it like a temporary arrangement. Stop sleeping in separate rooms. Stop keeping walls between us. I want a real marriage, Jack, if you do too." Jack's heart was pounding. He thought about Ruth buried on the hill, thought about the guilt he'd carried for 5 years, the belief that he didn't deserve to be happy again. But he also thought about Judge Harrison's words. "You've more than paid your debt. Maybe it was time to accept that." "I want that too." His voice was rough with emotion. "God knows I want that." Emma took his hand and led him inside. They stood in the cabin that had been his prison and was now becoming his home, looking at each other in the firelight. "I need to tell you something first." Emma's voice was steady, but Jack heard the nervousness underneath. "Before Thomas, there was no one. And during our marriage, he was kind, but not particularly interested in that aspect of things. What I'm trying to say is, I don't have much experience. Neither do I. Ruth and I had 3 years, but we were both young and figuring things out as we went." Jack stepped closer, cupping her face in his hands. "We'll figure this out together. No rush, no expectations. Just us. Just us," she echoed, smiling. That night, they shared Ruth's bed for the first time, and Jack finally understood what the pastor meant when he talked about two people becoming one flesh. It wasn't just about bodies joining, though. There was that too sweet and awkward and eventually wonderful. It was about walls coming down, about trust so complete that you could be vulnerable and know you were safe. Afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Emma's head on his chest and his arms around her, Jack felt a peace he'd thought was lost to him forever. "I love you." He said it quietly, testing the words. They felt right. Emma lifted her head to look at him. "I love you too. So much it scares me sometimes." "Why does it scare you?" "Because I've lost everyone I've ever loved. My parents. Thomas. I'm afraid that if I love you too much, something will happen to take you away too." Jack pulled her closer. "I can't promise nothing will ever happen. Life doesn't work that way. But I can promise I'm not going anywhere by choice. You're stuck with me, Emma Brennan. For better or worse. For better or worse." She repeated, and then she kissed him, and talking became unnecessary for quite some time. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Jack's life. He and Emma fell into a comfortable rhythm, working together during the day and sharing their nights. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Emma proved to have a gift for managing finances, keeping careful records of expenses and income in a way Jack had never bothered with. Under her guidance, they made plans to expand to buy more cattle and perhaps hire a hand or two to help with the work. In May, they received word that Marcus's trial had concluded. Guilty on all counts. 20 years in federal prison with no possibility of early release. Emma cried when she heard tears of relief and release. The nightmare was truly over. That same month, Henry and Martha approached them with a proposition. Sweetwater needed a school and they were organizing to build one. Would Emma consider teaching? Emma looked at Jack, her expression hopeful but uncertain. "What do you think? I think you'd be a wonderful teacher. And the children here deserve someone who actually knows what they're doing. It wouldn't be full-time, just a few days a week during the school term. I could still help with the ranch." "Emma, you don't need my permission. If you want to teach, teach." So Emma became Sweetwater's first real school teacher, working with the town to establish a curriculum and recruit students. She threw herself into the work with the same determination she brought to everything else, and Jack watched with pride as she transformed a rough wooden building into a place of learning. Summer came hot and bright. The cattle fattened on mountain grass. The garden Emma had planted behind the cabin produced more vegetables than two people could possibly eat, so they shared with neighbors and learned the art of canning for winter. Jack taught Emma to fish in the creek that ran through their property, and they spent lazy Sunday afternoons by the water talking about everything and nothing. It was during one of these afternoons that Emma brought up the subject Jack had been half expecting and half dreading. "Do you ever think about children?" Jack set down his fishing pole and looked at her. "Sometimes." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment, staring at the water. "Because we've been married for 4 months now. Really married. And I know you lost a child before. I just wonder if you'd want to try again." Jack chose his words carefully. "I won't lie and say I don't think about it, but I'm also not in any rush. We're still learning each other, building our life together. If children come, they come. If they don't, we'll still have each other, and that's enough for me." Emma nodded, but Jack saw something flicker in her eyes. Relief, maybe. Or gratitude. "Good," she said softly, "because that's exactly how I feel too." They sat in comfortable silence after that fishing until the sun began to set. And if Jack noticed that Emma seemed lighter afterward, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, he didn't mention it. 2 months later, Emma fainted while teaching. Martha Walsh brought her home worried and flustered. Jack was in the barn when they arrived, and he came running at Martha's shouts. She just collapsed, said she felt dizzy, and then down she went. Martha helped Emma into the cabin and onto the bed. "I think you should send for Dr. Patterson." The doctor arrived within the hour, a gruff man in his 50s who'd seen just about everything in his years practicing frontier medicine. He examined Emma while Jack paced outside like a caged animal. Finally, Doc Patterson emerged with a bemused expression. "Well, Brennan, congratulations." "Congratulations for what? Is she all right?" "She's fine. More than fine." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "She's pregnant. About 3 months along, I'd say." Jack felt the world tilt. He remembered Emma's question by the creek, her careful phrasing. If children come, they come. She hadn't said she couldn't have children, just that she wasn't in a rush, and neither of them had taken any particular precautions. "That's not possible." The words came out automatically, an echo of old fears. "The doctor in Boston said—" He stopped. Actually, Emma had never told him anything about a doctor in Boston. He'd just assumed based on her marriage to Thomas and the lack of children. "What doctor in Boston?" Doc Patterson raised an eyebrow. Jack realized his mistake. "Nothing." "Never mind. She's really pregnant." "She is. About 3 months, like I said. Everything looks normal and healthy." Doc Patterson clapped him on the shoulder. "You're going to be a father, Brennan." After the doctor left, Jack stood on the porch for a long moment, trying to process what he'd just learned. A father. After all these years, all the grief and guilt and fear, another chance. He went inside to find Emma sitting up in bed, her hands folded in her lap, her expression uncertain. "You heard." It wasn't a question. "I heard." Jack sat on the edge of the bed. "How long have you known?" "I suspected for about a month. But I wasn't sure. I was afraid to hope." She looked down at her hands. "Are you angry that I didn't tell you I suspected?" Angry? Jack almost laughed. "Emma, I'm terrified. I'm overwhelmed. I'm about a dozen other things I don't have names for. But angry isn't one of them." He took her hands in his. "A baby. Our baby. I never thought I'd get another chance at this." "So you're not disappointed? Disappointed that we're creating a new life together, that we're getting a chance to be parents?" "How could I possibly be disappointed?" Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I was afraid. Afraid you'd think I tricked you, or that you'd remember what happened with Ruth and be angry that I put us in this position." Jack pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "Listen to me. What happened with Ruth wasn't anyone's fault. It was tragedy. And this isn't that. This is different. You're different. We're different." He pulled back to look at her. "We're going to do this together. And we're going to do everything we can to make sure both you and the baby are healthy and safe. Doc Patterson knows what he's doing. We're not alone in this. Promise me something." Emma's voice was small. "Promise me that if something goes wrong, you won't blame yourself. I promise to try." It was the most honest answer he could give. The pregnancy changed everything and nothing. Emma continued teaching until she started showing, then handed the school over to a young woman from Helena who'd been looking for a position. She spent her days preparing for the baby, sewing tiny clothes and knitting blankets, her face glowing with a happiness Jack had never seen before. Jack became obsessively protective. He wouldn't let her lift anything heavy or work too hard or do any of the 100 things she'd been doing without issue for months. Emma tolerated his hovering with good humor, occasionally reminding him that pregnancy wasn't an illness. But at night, when she couldn't see his face, Jack lay awake listening to her breathe, terrified that he'd wake up and find her cold beside him. The nightmares returned, but now they featured Emma instead of Ruth, Emma screaming in pain while he stood helpless. One night in October, Emma woke to find him sitting by the window staring out at the darkness. "You're thinking about Ruth." It wasn't a question. Jack nodded. Emma got out of bed and came to sit beside him. "Tell me how she died." "All of it." Jack didn't want to speak those memories into existence again. But Emma deserved to know, deserved to understand what terrified him so completely. So he told her about the labor that went on for 20 hours, about Ruth's strength fading, about the midwife's increasingly desperate attempts to turn the baby, about the moment when Ruth stopped screaming and just looked at him with eyes that knew she was dying, about holding his daughter so small and perfect, watching her struggle to breathe with lungs that hadn't developed properly, about the choice he'd had to make, whether to stay with the dying child or comfort his dying wife, about choosing Ruth, about being with her at the end while his daughter took her last breath alone in a basket by the fire. "I failed them both," Jack's voice broke. "I couldn't save either of them." Emma took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "You didn't fail anyone. You were one man in an impossible situation. And Jack, you need to understand something. I'm not Ruth. This baby isn't that baby. What happened before doesn't have to happen again. But it could. It could. Lightning could strike the cabin. A bear could attack the cattle. 100 things could go wrong at any moment. But we can't live our lives paralyzed by fear of what might happen. How do you do it? How are you not terrified? I am terrified. Every single day. But I'm also excited and hopeful and so in love with this tiny person I haven't even met yet. Fear doesn't get to be the only thing I feel." Jack pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the swell of her belly pressed against him. "You're braver than I am." "No, I'm just choosing hope over fear. And so can you." The baby came in January during another blizzard. It seemed fitting somehow. Emma's labor started just after midnight, and Jack knew immediately this was different. Emma was calm, focused, her breathing steady even as the contractions grew stronger. But 3 hours in, something changed. Emma's face went white, and she grabbed Jack's hand with crushing force. "Something's wrong." Her voice was tight with pain. "Jack, something's wrong." Doc Patterson had arrived an hour earlier, anticipating a long labor. He examined Emma quickly, his face grave. The baby's breech. Feet first instead of head first. Jack felt his blood turn to ice. This was how it had started with Ruth. The baby in the wrong position. The long, terrible hours of labor. The inevitable ending. "Can you turn it?" His voice came out steady despite the terror coursing through him. "I can try. But Jack, you need to prepare yourself. This could go badly." "No," Emma's voice cut through the room like a blade. "No, it won't. I'm not Ruth. This baby isn't that baby. We're going to be fine." She looked at Jack, her eyes fierce despite the pain. "I need you to believe that, Jack. I need you to believe we're going to be fine." Jack knelt beside the bed and took her hand, holding it like a lifeline. "I believe you. We're going to be fine." The next 2 hours were the longest of Jack's life. Doc Patterson worked carefully, trying to turn the baby without injuring mother or child. Emma bore it with gritted teeth and iron determination, never once crying out, never once giving in to fear. And then, impossibly miraculously, the baby turned. "Got it." Doc Patterson's face flooded with relief. "Heads down. This should go normally now." 45 minutes later, their daughter was born, squalling and red-faced and absolutely perfect. "It's a girl." Doc Patterson placed the baby in Emma's arms, healthy as a horse. "You did it, Emma. You both did it." Jack looked at his wife, exhausted and triumphant, holding their daughter. And he understood something fundamental. The past didn't have to repeat itself. Fear didn't have to win. Sometimes with enough courage and determination and love, you could write a different ending. She's perfect. Emma was crying, but they were tears of joy. "Look at her, Jack. We made her." Jack touched his daughter's tiny hand, and she gripped his finger, her hold surprisingly strong. "Yes, we did. And she's going to have a different story than the one I feared. A better story." Doc Patterson checked Emma carefully, making sure there was no excessive bleeding, that everything had gone as it should. When he was satisfied, he clapped Jack on the shoulder. "You've got a healthy wife and a healthy baby. That's about as good as it gets." After the doctor left, promising to check back the next day, Jack and Emma lay together in the bed, their daughter between them. The baby was swaddled in one of the blankets Emma had knitted, her tiny face peaceful in sleep. "What should we name her?" Emma asked softly. Jack had been thinking about this. "I'd like to name her after Ruth, if that's all right with you." Emma smiled. "I think that's perfect. Ruth Emma Brennan." Ruth Emma. Jack reached out and touched his daughter's tiny hand. She gripped his finger reflexively, her hold surprisingly strong. "Welcome to the world, little one." They stayed like that for hours, neither sleeping, just watching their daughter breathe. And with each breath, Jack felt the weight of the past lifting a little more, making room for the future they were building together. The months that followed were exhausting and wonderful. Ruth was a good baby, sleeping well and eating enthusiastically. Emma took to motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else, though she was constantly asking Jack for reassurance that she was doing things right. "You're a natural," he told her one evening, watching her rock Ruth to sleep. "Stop worrying so much. I can't help it. She's so small and fragile. What if I do something wrong?" "You won't, and even if you do, we'll figure it out together." Spring came again, marking a full year since Emma had stumbled into Jack's life. They took Ruth up to the graves on the hill, showing her the resting place of the woman she was named after. Jack knelt by Ruth's grave and placed a hand on the wooden cross. "Ruth, I want you to meet your namesake, our daughter. She's beautiful and perfect, and everything good in the world." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I want to thank you for everything you were to me, for saving me after the war when I was lost, for loving me when I didn't think I deserved it, for giving me a reason to build a life instead of just surviving. But I also want to say goodbye, not to your memory or what we had, but to the guilt, to the belief that being happy without you is somehow a betrayal. Emma helped me understand that you wouldn't want that. You'd want me to live. So that's what I'm going to do. Live, really live, with Emma and Ruth and whatever future we build together. And I hope wherever you are, you're at peace. You deserve that." Emma's hand slipped into his. She was crying quietly, Ruth asleep in her arms. They walked back to the cabin together. A family, and Jack felt lighter than he had in years. The ghosts were finally at rest. The past had been honored and released, and the future stretched out before them, full of possibility. That night, after Ruth was asleep in her cradle, Jack and Emma sat on the porch watching the sunset. The ranch was thriving. The cattle were healthy. The community had embraced them fully. Life was good. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't come here?" Emma asked. "If I'd gotten your cancellation letter in time," Jack pulled her closer. "Every day, and every day I'm grateful you didn't. I almost turned back, you know. When the storm hit, I almost just found shelter and gave up on coming here. What made you keep going?" Emma smiled. "I saw your light in the darkness, and something told me that if I could just make it to that light, everything would be all right." Jack kissed her forehead. "You saved me, you know. I was dead inside, just going through the motions. You brought me back to life. We saved each other." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, one by one scattered across the vast Montana sky. Inside, their daughter slept peacefully, dreaming, whatever babies dream, and for the first time and longer than he could remember, Jack Brennan looked at the future without fear. He looked at it with hope. 5 years later, Jack stood in almost the same spot watching another sunset. Ruth was 5 now, a bright, curious child who followed him everywhere and asked endless questions about everything. Emma was pregnant again, carrying the son they'd decided to name Thomas after her first husband, a man who'd been kind to her when kindness was rare. The ranch had grown substantially. They'd hired 3 hands and doubled their cattle herd. Emma's school had expanded now, serving children from 5 surrounding ranches. They'd built an addition onto the cabin, adding 2 more bedrooms and a proper study where Emma could work on her lesson plans. Life was full and busy and occasionally chaotic. Jack had never been happier. He heard the cabin door open and small feet running across the porch. Ruth launched herself at him, and he caught her easily, swinging her up onto his shoulders. "Mama says dinner's ready. Tell Mama we'll be right there. First, I want to show you something." He carried Ruth up the hill to where two graves lay beneath an oak tree that had grown from a sapling to a strong young tree. Ruth knew about these graves, about the woman she was named for, and the baby who died before Ruth was born. Remember what I told you about the woman buried here? She was your first wife and you loved her very much. That's right. And you know what she'd think if she could see us now? What she'd think we were doing just fine. She'd be happy that I found your mother and that we have you and that we're building a good life together. Ruth considered this seriously. Do you think she's watching us? Maybe. I like to think so. But whether she is or isn't, I know she'd approve. She always wanted me to be happy. Are you happy? Papa Jack looked at his daughter at the ranch spreading out below them at the cabin where Emma was preparing dinner and their son was growing. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from a boy who'd made a terrible mistake to a soldier trying to outrun his past to a broken widower who thought his life was over. And then he thought about the woman who'd stumbled through a blizzard and changed everything, who'd seen past his size and his scars to the man underneath, who'd stood beside him against danger and fear and the weight of the past, who'd given him a second chance at everything he'd thought he'd lost. Yes, he said simply, I'm very, very happy. They walked back to the cabin together, father and daughter, toward the light and warmth and the family waiting for them. And Jack Brennan, former soldier, former wanted man, former broken widower, went to dinner with his wife and daughter, grateful beyond measure for blizzards and second chances, and stubborn women who refused to give up, grateful for love that came when you least expected it and needed it most, grateful for home.